Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Greaves, professor at the Florida Institute of Technology and the co-director of its Center for Lifecycle and Innovation Management. And today I'm here to talk to you about process and practice. You obviously have heard about process since this has been the focus of organizations for the past 20 or 30 years and a major impetus in terms of developing processes for today's organizations. You may not be aware of practices, even though today's successful organizations engage in that on a regular basis. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the framework and understanding of process and practice, what we're calling PNP, and how it applies to today's modern organizations and why both are extremely important. The issue about a process is that while it is good for efficiency and for doing things over and over again, the definition of sanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, however. And that's been attributed to Albert Einstein. And the issue of it is that while process is critical for today's organizations in order to be able to do some things well, the focus of today's organization is also on innovation. And process and innovation don't go well together. The issue is that we need some other capability that allows us to basically be able to innovate, and the process is not that mechanism. And so we need to be talking about something very different if we're going to be talking about innovation, which in survey after survey of CEOs in today's organization ranks above productivity and efficiency as their number one issue. To give you an idea of what we're talking about here, what I would like to do is to look at what are defined as two processes. The top one actually is a process. It basically is the ability to define specific activities that I can, in essence, almost program people to perform. So basically, if you look at it, it's basically to check for general dimensioning and tolerances. Is that okay? Yes. It goes on to approve a design. If not, it goes back. And so each of these boxes represent a specific activity that I can, in essence, define the inputs and what I need to do with those inputs in a very specific manner in order to be able to produce my desired results. The bottom process is different, even though it's a process that starts at the beginning and ends when I finish the process. Within that process, there are blocks of what I will call practices, because I have no way of defining well how it is, for example, that I basically develop specifications to meet requirements of my product. That activity is very idiosyncratic, and while I have methodologies to do that, I really can't say, do this, do this, do this, and this is how you, in essence, be able to define the specifications that are a result of of the requirements that I'm trying to meet. Processes are exactly that. If I can say do this, do this, do this, and you always get the result that you desire, then that truly is a process. But if I'm basically having to take an end result and try to figure out how to get that end result, that is not a practice. That is something that I call, that is not a process. That is something I call a practice. And those are very, very different from the processes. So even though these two look the same, they really are very different once I take them apart. So I have a real process at the top, very well defined. I can basically create an algorithm for it. On the bottom, I have a process that starts at the beginning and ends, but within that are these elements of practice that are not well defined, and I basically have to do different things in order to be able to obtain them. So looking at this a little more carefully, we can first start off with a process definition that everybody is probably very well aware of, And that's a series of sequential or operations conducing to an end, especially continuous operation or treatment, especially in manufacturing. And this definition comes straight from the dictionary, and it sort of defines what we think of a process, in that it's procedure-driven and moves from selecting the inputs and moving forward to do something with those inputs and getting a result. So we start off with our process. We define the inputs that we want to have the process deal with. We basically create the activities that that process is involved with, and we get a result. Out of a process, we're always going to get a result because that's how these things are defined. And as processes go, the idea behind a process is this result that we always want. But processes are sort of defined from a hierarchy above to say, if you take these inputs and you combine them in these particular ways, you're always going to get a result that is something that we want. And so processes, by their very nature, are forward-driven from inputs to routines to an output that we desire. Practices, on the other hand, have not been very well understood in today's organizations, even though we engage in them, and it's pretty much the way we get innovation and problem solving, but we really haven't had a very good definition of practices or even had language to talk about practices in order to be able to do the work that we need to do. And so my definition of a practice is that it's an integrative, iterative, comprehensive approach to identifying inputs and operations by which a desired goal-driven result is produced. And so while we start with in a practice, the first thing we really start with is the output. This is the desired output. If it's innovation, it may be something that we've never done before. It's a problem solving. It's basically fixing a problem that we're encountering. But it's a different approach to the issue. We can't say, do this, and your problem is solved, or do this, and you'll have a new and innovative product. Instead, we have to start from a desired end result, which may or may not be attainable, and be able to then find what are the inputs and what are the operations that we need to perform on those inputs in order to be able to obtain our end goal result. Practices are a lot tougher than processes because, first of all, we don't even know whether we can obtain the desired result. And secondly, there may be different ways of being able to approach it that may be legitimate for the people doing it, but different people are going to have different approaches to a particular problem. So practices are basically this backward-oriented, goal-driven way of doing things that are very, very different from processes. And so in terms of basically engaging in our activities, especially when we're talking about creating new and innovative products, we need to start with the end result and then work our way through that. So very, very different from processes, which are basically input routine-driven moving forward. Practices are goal-driven and are basically, in essence, trying to find the inputs and the way we can connect those inputs together in order to produce that output. Process and practices, while they are distinct, they exist on what I will contend is a continuum. And so if I look at it from a systems approach of linking these inputs to outputs, on the well-defined side, where I have well-defined inputs and I have well-defined routines that I'm going to run against those inputs, I basically have the ability to have processes. So again, as I said, processes are, and I get the rap for sometimes being anti-process, but I'm good with the idea that says, look, if you can say do this in this particular fashion, and you always get the output that you want, you can make that a process. So if I'm saying, look, we want the weights of a new aircraft, and here are all the aircraft parts, here's how you add them up, and it always gives me the same weight over and over again because I've included everything in that I need. That's a great process to have, and I ought to define that as a process. On the other side of the coin, though, is I have less defined activities that I'm doing. And in point of fact, I may have a goal, and in point of fact, it may be a goal that I'm going to have to change over time. For example, if I have competing requirements. So I want an aircraft or an automobile that is fuel efficient, but is very strong and sturdy. Those are sort of competing. I can make it very, very light, which will give me great fuel efficiency, but it may not be strong enough to withstand the forces that occur against it. On the other hand, if I address those forces, I may not be able to get to fuel efficiency. So I may have trade-offs as I sort of define my goal and objective. And so basically this is a search in terms of trying to, first of all, define what that goal and objective is and whether it's reachable. And then secondly, being able to find the inputs and the routines against those inputs that will make that possible. But it's a continuum in that this is ill-defined on the left-hand side and well-defined on the right-hand side, and I may have activities and tasks that fall, at those two ends, which are sort of the extreme, but also somewhere in between. So I have this process practice on a continuum. The underlying assumptions that I have to deal with here is the things that I'm talking about with respect to obtaining the right desire. And that is, I'm a big believer that language both determines and reflects thinking and understanding. So there's a simple phrase that, how we talk about things is how we think about things, and that has been validated again and again by the linguistics and neuroscience people in terms of saying that if we talk about something in a certain way, we're going to think about it. There is the apocryphal story about Eskimos and the number of words they have for snow, which is sort of true and not true, but there are sort of a different language, different words that basically allow people in specific areas to define what it is that they're talking about. So language does both determine and reflect our thinking and understanding. Process, this idea of process implies neat, orderly, logical, linear activities, and that's the reason we like process, because it does have this implication that we are in firm control of our activities around us. And so we like processes, especially in the technical area, because we like neat, orderly, and logical, linear things. However, a major activity in addition to processes occur in organizations that innovate well. And so this is the messy part of today's organizations in terms of basically doing innovation and problem solving. But this is really kind of the important stuff that we do in today's organizations. So in addition to basically doing processes, which are in essence, again, if we can define them well and it's always the output we desire, that basically frees us our activity level up for doing these messy things like creating new and innovative products or solving thorny problems that occur. And so this is the underlying assumption that we have, and this is why we sort of gravitated to this idea of process. That's something that we do is called from my terminology, practice, and it has gotten short shrift in today's organizations as we have focused primarily on the idea of process. But practice is some of the more interesting things and more profitable things, and in point of fact, the innovative and tougher problems that we face, and we really need to, in essence, think about how it is that we talk about practice in today's organizations. We do a good job talking about process. It's dominated our discussion. In fact, we sometimes say that we're a slave to those processes, which means that we are not, in essence, doing what we need to do in terms of innovation and problem solving. We need to talk about practice in that same way. It's complementary to our process discussions. So the result is that processes and practices intermix in today's organizations. They always have and they always will, and we need to basically have a better understanding of practice if we're going to, in essence, do a more effective and efficient job in the areas where it's important that we be innovative and do creative problem solving. Everything, by definition, is a process since we live in a time-based universe. So we begin things and we end things. Sometimes, especially in projects, we may never end them, but in theory, there's always an end in time where the task that we've defined comes to an end. But this idea of process is probably embedded in the way we think about things, and in point of fact, it is an important concept because we really are in a time-based universe, and we need to have a beginning to things, and we need to have an end to things. However, within this overall process of beginning and ending, we have both processes and practices. And to date, we have spent a great deal of time in processes, value stream mapping, Lean Six Sigma, activities like that, where we basically would like to believe that these processes are neat and orderly. However, intermixed within those processes, if we take our tasks apart, are things that we call practices, which are these goal-driven activities that we engage in. Even within these macro process and practices, we can further break them down into other processes and practices. So we may have a process, but within that process, we may engage in a practice. So it requires some problem solving. Even though the process is well defined, we have one element of it. So process and practices intermix on a constant basis. And what we need to do is be looking at our tasks and basically deconstructing them into this idea of whether they are primarily a process or primarily a practice. How do we understand the difference between process and practice, and what are the sorts of things that we ought to be looking at with respect to discriminating and determining what's a process and what's a practice? And at the first level, the most important thing that I sort of defined is that processes are lean. We're looking for a process that basically uses the minimal amount of resources, and no matter who is engaged in that process, we're going to get the same outputs each and every time. And practices, on the other hand, however, are about being innovative, as I've talked about before. We basically are looking at this idea of creating something that we haven't created in the past. As an outcome of that, processes are predictable. So if I have sort of defined exactly how I'm taking these inputs and how I'm going to combine them, then I should each and every time be able to predict what the outcome is, or else it really isn't a process. Because what the whole intent here is, as I said, if I can say do this, do this, do this, and you always get the output that you want, that's predictable and that's a process. Practices, on the other hand, are unpredictable by their very nature. Especially when we're talking about innovation, creating something that we had never created before, such as a composite airplane, while there was a lot of work done to say, yes, that's possible, there were a lot of elements of unpredictability in being able to do something new and different like that. And as I said before, when we start to have competing goals and outcomes, it gets very unpredictable as to whether we can basically obtain those. And so this predictability versus unpredictability, predictability is a hallmark of processes, unpredictability is a hallmark of practices. So those are two kind of things that we are looking at: lean and innovative, and predictable and unpredictable. Processes, as I have talked about up till now, are input routine driven. And so as I have pointed out, that processes, because they're hierarchical in nature, somebody has defined that these are the things that we're going to do, are basically, we have defined the inputs, we've defined the routines or operations we're going to perform on those inputs, and we always get a result. And the idea behind a process is always to get a result we want. We can have defective processes. The one I like to use is an example of a TSA agent who, when faced with a 3-ounce bottle with a small amount of liquid in it, rejected it because it didn't meet his process. And when the traveler complained that, hey, this bottle has less than 3 ounces of liquid in it, said, sir, I am an employee of the federal government. I am not allowed to exercise common sense. And that's sort of one of the hallmarks of processes, is that common sense is factored in, and the output you get is going to be the output you use. And so you need to make sure that it really is the output you want. Whereas I mentioned, practices are goal seeking. I mean, we are going to seek a goal either in a new and innovative product or in solving a problem that we're faced that we may not have seen before. Processes are pretty well defined in terms of being precise. I basically are defining them well enough that I can basically put different people in the same processes and expect to get the same result each and every time, where practices are fuzzy. Processes are codable, calculable. I can basically code and calculate the process and determine how long it'll take, look at takt times and things like that in order to be able to do that. Practices are negotiable and arguable. So I always love to have engineers say, we have a process for defining requirements to specifications, and you sit in a room and see them arguing, trading off, negotiating, and you find out that these are really not a process. This is a practice that they engage in. And quite frankly, it's the most important thing that they do, because they're basically trying to get this goal. Processes are about efficiency. I want to use as minimum amount of resources as possible, where practices are about effectiveness. It's about getting to the goal. If I have a very efficient process that doesn't give me what I want to get, it's useless to me. So the key behind practice, not that I don't want to be efficient in terms of my practices, but at the end of the day, what I really want to do is to have an effective outcome in terms of obtaining the result that I want. Processes are hierarchical driven. So somebody has defined what this process is, and people are expected to execute it. Where practices, I want to basically push down the decision to being peer or expert driven. So the people most knowledgeable make the decision about how that problem should be solved or how I'm going to obtain the results that I desire. I don't want friction in terms of processes. I like it to be a smooth, well-oiled machine, where quite frankly, in practices, arguments, discussions, assuming that they're based on getting the result and they're not about power plays, is important, because a lot of times out of this friction comes a synthesizing of a new problem and a way to solve that problem. Processes are about optimizing. I can optimize a process. I get to have a practice, I get it to be good enough. That doesn't mean mediocre, but when I start to see diminishing returns in the time I'm spending, I need to stop in terms of that practice. Processes, people like them because they're energy efficient in terms of mental activities. I can basically do processes on autopilot, where practices is about making sense of the problems that I see at hand. I will talk about this a little later, but I will contend that processes are about training. I want to train you how to do the process, where practice, it's important that not only that you do it, but you know why you do it, because when you come across situations that you haven't seen before, you can basically adjust the way you do things. So these are the major criteria between process and practice that I've sort of defined. There are a few other ones that come to mind, and you probably may think of some of them yourself, but these are the ones that I see time and time again in differentiating between whether something's a process or something's a practice. Consistent with this idea that process and practice is on a continuum, I can basically create a matrix where on the x-axis I have practice, and I designate it as low or high, and process on the y-axis designated low or high. And I can put basically different functions onto this matrix, because different functions will have sort of different requirements or a different mix of process and practice. And obviously the one that immediately comes to mind in terms of process, where I want very high process and little if no practice, is repeat manufacturing. So I do not want people out on an assembly line to decide, I think I'm going to do something different today in terms of manufacturing that particular product or the assembly of that particular product. If I've done my job properly as a manufacturing engineer, I have a process that is the minimum use of resources and the maximum efficiency on that factory floor. I may change it, I may have suggestions from people who are doing it, but at the end of the day, I am really focused on the fact that I want people to do exactly the process over and over again in the same way. At the other sort of end of the spectrum is where I have high practice, and low process is in craft manufacturing and research and development. I don't necessarily know how I'm going to get this new and innovative thing that I'm looking for, and so while I may have a methodology, and I differentiate very clearly between methodology and process. A methodology is an approach to a particular problem. It doesn't define how I do it. Research and development is about creating new and innovative things. So I cannot say, here's my process for research and development, because it is about trying to create an end goal that I wish to obtain, and then figuring out how I'm going to go get that. Within that spectrum, I basically am going to have other activities that I'm engaged in. So when I'm talking about innovative engineering, there will be some process. I may have stage gate activities involved. But I'm basically still trying to, within a framework, do something innovative that I haven't done before. In terms of incremental engineering, assuming that I have a small number of possible combinations, I can apply a process to it and say, let's try this, let's try that. So trial and error, which we've always done. But again, I mean, that is an issue of basically trying all the possible combinations and seeing what works. It will work if I have a small amount of combinations, but I can get incremental engineering or improvements out of process. But ideally, what I'd like to do is to try to apply knowledge and go for an end result and try to work backwards to see how I can get that. Manufacturing engineering is somewhere in between. But these, if I sort of look at the various activities, while I have ones that are out at the limits, repeat manufacturing and research and development, I really in most functions have a mixture of process and practice that I need to engage in. So while we have spent a great deal of time in terms of defining processes, what are the desired practice characteristics that we ought to be focused on? And my number one on the list is this idea of critical thinking. And my contention is that in today's organizations, sometimes that's in fairly short supply, especially when we have computers involved and we can crank through a bunch of numbers and come up with a desired result. And in one situation, a professor was telling me that a student had cranked through the numbers and came up with the answer of 10 to the 400th, which is probably more atoms than there are in the universe. And when he was questioned about it, the student said, well, gee, this is micrometers, not meters. Well, just for the micrometers to meters, you're still an awfully big number that was out of the realm of possibility. And so this idea of thinking critically, reducing the problem and thinking about it in a critical fashion, for example, doing a free body thought experiment on it is really important. And we really, I think, have bred a lot of that out of today's engineers and product developers by having this focus on process. So critical thinking is my number one on the list of desired practice characteristics, getting people to think critically about the situations that they're involved with. A continuous reevaluation of assumptions, environments, and behaviors. So this is sometimes called scanning. But often, and especially if I am engaged in a process rather than a practice where I should be engaged in a practice, is that I turn the crank and the assumptions I start off with is the same assumptions I use even if they've changed. So for example, the assumption about what fuel costs are has caused a great deal of problem in the auto industries because they start to design a product under the assumption of expensive fuel costs, and by the time the car comes out, the fuel costs have dropped dramatically, or vice versa. And so that is sometimes out of their control, but there are a lot of things where the assumptions do change, but we really don't take into account what the change in assumptions or environments or even the behaviors of the users that we're looking at are with respect to the products that we're designing. So this continuous reevaluation, which is certainly something that is critical in product development and problem solving, is a practice characteristic that we really haven't paid as much attention to as we ought to. Resistance to oversimplification. We really like to simplify because that makes life a lot easier and we don't have to think as hard. But sometimes these problems are a lot thornier, and by simplifying them, we basically gloss over aspects, inputs, and operations that we ought to be concerned about. And so the idea behind a process is about oversimplification. I'm simply taking thought out of how I do a process in order to be able to get the outcome. But in terms of trying to solve a very thorny problem or to create something new and innovative, I really have to keep all my inputs and options open for as long as I possibly can. Alert to weak signals. This is one of the more interesting ones in that, that in process, if it was an important signal, it would be taken account in the process. But it's weak signals that indicate that something else is going on that we are not seeing at the moment. So we're looking for anomalies in terms of results. For example, we see a little bit of flutter and we basically say, well, ignore that. That's not part of our design process, and yet that flutter is an indication that there is something that is dramatically going to cause us a problem later on in the design cycle. So this idea of being alert to weak signals is extremely important in looking for not only the obvious things, but looking for things that signal that something else is going on that we don't understand and we really need to take a look at. The most knowledgeable make decisions. And so in process, people are fairly interchangeable, but when we're talking about basically problem solving and innovation, we really want the most knowledgeable to make the decisions about how we proceed, because they have, in essence, the domain expertise in order to be able to do that. That has been sort of problematic as we spread people across the world, but it's important that we basically defer to the most knowledgeable and bring them involved in decision making and problem solving, because they basically have the information that they need. And finally, what we need to do is understand that knowledge is created, captured, and reused. Even in today's industrial organizations, the conclusion has been coming out that their asset is not in the plant and equipment that they have, but in the people that walk out the door every night. And this is becoming very much at the forefront of an issue as we see the baby boomers who have a great deal of institutional knowledge retiring. And so we've got to basically figure out how to create, capture, and reuse knowledge so that we can basically do a good job in terms of effective problem solving and innovation. So these are the desired practice characteristics that I would contend are things that we need to take a look at. So what's the path to practices and innovation? I mean, how do we proceed from here in terms of being able to in essence, swing the pendulum back from this process-only orientation to a more balanced approach to process and practices that we really need? And the first thing is simply introducing the concept of the practice-process continuum, and the language about this is important. In the organizations that I've seen this happen, once I sort of give this talk about the idea that there is something other than process in the organizations, it opens up a whole degree of dialogue about the activities that people engage in and whether they are process and practice. And it causes people to look at things in a different light. For example, things that are practices that have been cast as processes, they have been trying to, in essence, change the process every time it doesn't come out right. And they have been woefully unsuccessful in basically doing that because they keep adding process after process after process, and only to find out that when the next time they do something, they have a different issue. So they decide that this is really a practice and they ought to be approaching that differently. So simply introducing the concept of practice-process, the practice-process continuum, and the language about that is, I think, simply a first step and an important step in getting people to think about this differently. The second thing is then looking at categorizing these activities into process and practices. So again, one of the other issues that you have is the fact that that if everything's a process and yet some processes are optional, you get poor process compliance for those things that you must have. So categorizing activities into processes and then defining that these processes are required to do is important in enhancing compliance. And on the other side is defining the fact that these are practices and these are the end results we're looking at, and that's that the important thing is not to have gone through the activities and not get the result and then hide behind the fact that says, gee, I did the process, but I didn't get the result, so the failure was not mine, is something that would help by holding people accountable for end result, the end result of the activity, and not simply the fact that they followed some sort of defined process that didn't get them there. I sort of contend that processes are about training. I mean, what I want, if I can say do this, do this, and I always get the result I want, then what I need to do is to train people on doing that. And so they don't need to know necessarily why they're doing it. They just need to have a proficiency in being able to perform those processes in the manner that's prescribed, and the more they do it, the better they get. On the other hand, practices require education. I need to know not only what the methodology that I'm going to employ, I need to know why I'm doing it. So when things differ from what I'm expecting, I can basically adjust my approach to the solving of the problem or the creation of something new and innovative that I haven't done in the past. And so what I want to do is to train on processes, but I want to educate people about practices so that they can, in essence, be goal-driven and innovative and problem-solving in their approach to their work. But finally, then I have to operationalize practices. I need to define, validate, and communicate what I'm trying to do and how I'm expected to do it. So I'm looking at basically creating centers of excellence and communities of practice in order to be able to help people understand how I should approach the problem and what constitutes success in where I'm focused on. So these are the paths to practices and innovation that I think all organizations ought to do. Most organizations have some sort of process organization. I will contend that very few, if any, have practice operations. We need to have, in essence, a balanced approach. So I'd certainly like to leave you with just sort of one question, and that is, what processes in your organization really are practices? So think about that, and I think it will help you in understanding this differentiation between process and practice and why both are important in today's modern organization.